We've looked at how COVID-19 exposed and exacerbated the existing poverty trap and the feminization of poverty. The poverty trap and feminization, as well as racialization of poverty, are interconnected with the structure of our economy, including the system of capitalism. In this mini lecture, I am going to prepare you to engage with the ideas of the guest lecturers this module by unpacking the concepts of political economy and capitalism. Rather than treating economy as a rationalist, independent, and apolitical entity, sociologists have a long tradition of analyzing economic systems in intersection with politics and studying the relationship between individuals, markets, and the state. We can unpack the political economy approach into two separate but related components. So what is politics? Politics is the study of how power is distributed, who makes decisions, and where does authority lie. The economy refers to the social institutions through which a society's resources, including goods and services, are managed. When studying the economy, sociologists usually look at how goods and services are produced and distributed to meet the needs of the population. This is known as the economic problem. If we put this all together, a political economy approach analyzes who and what makes key decisions regarding solutions to the economic problem and in whose interests. One of the major economic systems in modern societies is capitalism. Scholars have various definitions for capitalism. Here, we draw upon the definition from Little et al. In 2014. Capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership of means of production, property, or capital, competitive markets, wage labor, and the impetus to produce profit and accumulate private wealth. Sociologists ask a variety of questions about capitalism. Some of the key questions for us in this lesson are: who owns the means of production? Means of production would include the tools, facilities, and raw materials for making goods, for example. What is being exchanged and how? What is the goal of production under capitalism? Who is benefited and who is served by this production and how it's organized? And how is capitalism evolving and impacting our social life? What does it lead to? What could it lead to? Let's break down potential answers to these questions. You might notice that we are using the language of Karl Marx. Karl Marx is seen as one of the founders of the conflict approach to sociology. This is an approach that sees society as fundamentally unequal and based on power struggles between different sociologically significant groups. Many sociologists don't embrace all of Marx's ideas, but there is certainly value in how he conceptualized society and the economy, and some of his insights are still relevant for interpreting contemporary economic patterns in capitalist societies. So let's answer these questions together. Who owns the means of production? The means of production is privately owned and controlled within capitalism as opposed to systems of state ownership, for example. What's being exchanged and how? Under capitalism, it's not only physical objects that are traded as goods. Labor is also purchased from workers by owners or capitalists for a wage or salary. Marx would say that human labor is being commodified under this system, turned into a thing with a quantifiable value. And one question is, should human labor be treated as a thing? We'll come back to this again later in this lesson as we think about the economy in a time of COVID-19. So what is the goal of production? The goal of production is to make a profit from selling commodities in a competitive free market. In other words, to produce surplus value. From a conflict sociological perspective, many scholars would argue that it is people who have capital, who own the means of production, that are able to benefit the most. After all, capitalism is literally based on having access to capital. We'll talk about this idea more as well. A highly competitive capitalist system of economy can lead to constant expansion of markets, globalization of investment, growth and centralization of capital, economic crises, class conflict, and so on. For those of you that have studied the economy from different perspectives, perhaps from different disciplines or theoretical lenses, what are your thoughts on how the approach presented here compares to others? What are the assumptions made in this approach, and what are the assumptions made in other approaches? What is most useful for understanding economies of COVID? We can also look at the economy and capitalism from a global perspective. We can look at the entire global economy as one world system. This is what the late American sociologist and economic historian Immanuel Wallerstein famously argued beginning in the 1970s. Wallerstein served as past president of the International Sociological Association and was acting as a research scholar at Yale until his passing in August 2019. Wallerstein's world systems approach viewed nations not just within the context of their own national economy, but as shaped by their positions in the world economic system. For example, health issues differ between high-income nations and low-income nations, or what he called core nations, semi-peripheral nations, and peripheral nations. While Canada is concerned about timely access to healthcare, peripheral nations or low-income countries are facing pressing health issues such as infectious disease, high infant mortality rates, lack of doctors and nurses, and inadequate water. We can ask about the appropriate terminology for describing these differences between countries. What Wallerstein referred to as the core, today some refer to as the global north. These would often refer to wealthy, industrialized countries of Western Europe, North America, Australia, and Japan. These countries also tend to have colonial and imperial histories and presence. What Wallerstein called the periphery, today we might refer to as the global south, in relation to poorer countries of the world located largely in Asia, South America, and Africa. These countries tend to have histories of colonization. You will see various terminology in your own studies and discussions in the media used to discuss the relative positions of the world's countries. Names for these categories have changed over time. Historically, these countries have been referred to as First World, Second World, Third World, although this language has been debunked for some of its problematic assumptions and implications. Here we see Wallerstein's references as core, semi-periphery, and periphery, and many sociologists today refer to more descriptive language of low, mid, and high-income countries. If we see the world system in terms of colonialism and imperialism, we can see imperial countries as those which exert substantial influence and power over other countries, whether overtly through things like occupation or more covertly through things like economic trade relationships. We can think of the periphery as countries that have been colonized in the past or present, where they have social, economic, and political systems established by the imperial countries. In some cases, imperial countries have put systems in place that leave colonies economically or otherwise dependent on the imperial nation. There's a lot more to discuss about these contested categories. This is just a brief introduction. The takeaway point is that the international system is a hierarchy that has been conceptualized in a variety of ways with unique names and assumptions. One way to think about the world system is through the global supply chain of personal protective equipment. The production of surgical masks and N95 respirators has revealed much about our world economic system in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. As you might have experienced, COVID-19 has caused a dramatic shortage in the supply of face masks. It was difficult to purchase a mask in early February in Vancouver, for example, even before many of us received accurate information on whether we should even wear a mask. Right now, we can easily purchase masks in the grocery store. What has happened? There are many ways to examine this, but there are two things in particular that we can analyze through a sociological lens. The first is the globalization of capitalism, and the second is the role of the state in responding and intervening at a societal level regarding masks. As Matin Basbay wrote in the May 2020 opinion piece titled "Globalization at the Crossroads of COVID-19, the shortage of masks and its impact on global health has highlighted the interdependence of the world system and the fragility of the global economy resulting from such interdependence." Basbay writes, quote, "The breaking of one single link in the chain is apparently enough to cause all hell to break loose." Prior to COVID-19, China made close to half of the world's masks, which were normally regarded as a seemingly low-value, ordinary, non-necessary product except for medical professionals. Upon the outbreak of COVID-19 in Wuhan, China not only needed to import masks from other countries, but there was also a major disruption in the global supply of masks, one of the basic important necessities that everyone now needs. Like many countries in the global north, Switzerland relies heavily on the global supply chain for face masks. Further, Italy is getting 800,000 masks from South Africa alone, despite more countries, including Japan, Taiwan, India, and Thailand, starting to make masks. The shortage of masks and many countries' inability to produce low-value face masks is the result of 40 years of reliance on cheap Chinese labor that often lacks adequate safety and environmental protections. And it reminds us of the dark side of global capitalism. That is, the exploitation of cheaper and less regulated labor in countries in the global south. While globalization is often portrayed as a win-win mechanism for both wealthier and poorer countries, both multinational corporations and poorer communities and individuals in need of work and money, COVID-19 has again challenged the foundations of this globalization. Lastly, COVID-19 has underscored some of the central ideas of political economy. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development released a report on policy responses to coronavirus, which suggested, quote, free trade and trade facilitation are not enough to solve the current shortage, unquote. COVID-19 has revealed some of the limitations of free trade and markets in responding to crises like this one. Many argue that capitalism or capitalist states have failed in fighting against COVID-19. So, what's the role and impact of the state in responding to COVID-19, particularly the shortage of masks? In Context magazine, Sociology for the Public's special issue on COVID-19, Wanzi Liu has compared governmental intervention in face mask markets across 4 Asian polities. As shown in this table, to ease the shortage panic over face masks and to ensure the supplies of face masks for healthcare workers, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan each adopted a range of policies that symbolize different ways and degrees of government intervention. While Hong Kong initially decided to pose no control over masks, South Korea and Taiwan enforced a name-based rationing plan to allocate face masks as an attempt to control the quantity and distribution of masks. The Singaporean government, rather, focused on the price of masks and thus applied a price cap regulation. The Taiwanese government also regulated both the price and the quantity of face masks. So what did these different approaches lead to? Some highlights. With the force of market mechanisms, prices of face masks skyrocketed in Hong Kong, and healthcare workers faced a shortage of medical masks. Whereas in South Korea and Taiwan, the rationing plan allowed each citizen to, quote, purchase 2 to 3 masks using national identification cards every week at prices higher than before the outbreaks. However, it's still hard to judge the overall impact of the rationing systems. More generally, the reason why I include this comparative example is to open up a discussion on the role of markets and government in healthcare, including times of health crisis. This brings us to the main focus of today's class, the economy and capitalism under and after COVID-19. Our guest lecturers today are Professor Tom Kempel and Professor Amy Hanser. Professor Kempel teaches classical and contemporary social theory classes, as well as interpretive methods, interdisciplinary approaches to the humanities and social sciences. His research advances European and North American traditions of classical and contemporary social theory from the late 18th century to the present. Professor Kempel has published several books, including Intellectual Work and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber's Calling in 2014, and Reading Marx Writing, Melodrama, the Market, and the Grundrisse from 1995. Professor Amy Hanser's research centers topics such as work, gender, and cultural aspects of the market. Much of her research has focused on contemporary China. Professor Hanser teaches classes sociology of work, social inequality, gender relations, economic sociology, and sociology of culture, including a focus on sociology of food. Hanser's book, Service Encounters, Class, Gender, and the Market for Social Distinction in Urban China, has explored how social and economic changes to Chinese society created new cultural values and forms of inequality. Professor Hanser will build on Karl Polanyi's 4 ideas to investigate the relationship between market, state, and society in a time of COVID-19. After that, Professor Kempel will take us on an introductory tour of Karl Marx and Max Weber's capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, COVID capitalism, and the role of the state. Lastly, we'll consider what an anti-capitalism society might look like after COVID.